Somewhere in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a family sits down to Sunday dinner in a farmhouse their ancestors built nearly 300 years ago. They call themselves Pennsylvania Dutch. They know the family Bible lists a great-great-great-grandfather who crossed the Atlantic before the Revolutionary War. They know the surname on that Bible's cover, and they know it has not changed in 2 centuries. What they do not know, not yet, is what happens when a small vial of saliva gets shipped off to a laboratory and comes back with a genetic map that looks nothing like the tidy American story they were handed at every family reunion. The report does not say Colonial Pioneer. It says Rhineland. It says Palatinate. It says a percentage so concentrated that the lab's own software sometimes flags it as unusual, a block of code too clean, too whole, too undiluted for 300 years on American soil. This is not a rare event confined to one household. It happens across Ohio, Indiana, Ontario, and the deep hollows of the Shenandoah Valley, anywhere a specific set of surnames put down roots 3 centuries ago and then, for reasons the family history rarely bothers to explain, simply stopped marrying outside the community. 16 surnames in particular carry this signature more consistently than almost any other cluster of names in North America. Miller, Weaver, Snyder, Zimmerman, Fisher, King, Klein, Hoover, Kaufman, Stauffer, Hare, Groff, Landis, Brubaker, Bechtel, Eschliman. If your family tree holds any one of these 16 names, the story that follows may already be written into your own DNA, waiting for a lab technician to read it back to you. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand where these 16 names came from, you have to leave Pennsylvania behind entirely and follow the Rhine River south, past Cologne, past Bonn, into a stretch of land that no longer exists on any modern map under the name it carried then. The Palatinate, in German, the Pfalz, a patchwork of small principalities along the Middle Rhine, fertile, wooded, and catastrophically positioned. For nearly a century before a single Palatine family boarded a ship for Philadelphia, this region absorbed almost every war fought in Western Europe. The 30 Years' War tore through it between 1618 and 1648, leaving whole villages depopulated. Barely 2 generations later, the 9 Years' War brought the armies of Louis XIV back across the same ground. In 1689, French troops under royal order carried out a deliberate scorched earth campaign, burning Heidelberg, Mannheim, Worms, and Speyer to the foundations. Contemporary accounts describe entire towns reduced to ash in a single winter. The strategy was not incidental cruelty. It was policy, designed to deny the enemy any territory worth holding. Then came the winter that finished what the armies had started. The Great Frost of 1709 froze rivers solid across the continent, killed livestock in their barns, and destroyed the vineyards and orchards the Palatinate depended on for its economy. Families who had survived 2 generations of invading armies now watched their food supply freeze in the ground. It was in the spring that followed, 1709, that an already desperate population made a decision that would echo for 3 centuries. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 Palatines, entire villages at a time, abandoned their farms and walked north along the Rhine toward Rotterdam, carrying what they could on their backs, hoping for passage to anywhere that was not the Palatinate. What they found first was not America. It was London, or more precisely the open fields outside it, where by the summer of 1709, as many as 13,000 Palatine refugees were living in tents and makeshift camps at Blackheath and Camberwell, a humanitarian crisis large enough that English officials and pamphleteers spent months debating what to do with them. Some were sent to Ireland, settled in County Limerick, where descendants of these Irish Palatines still carry the name today, 400 years removed from the Rhine and still recognizable in local records. Others were shipped to the colony of New York, resettled along the Hudson and Mohawk valleys in a failed scheme to produce naval tar from the pine forests there. The tar scheme collapsed within a few years, unable to turn a profit for the English crown that had funded it, but the migration itself did not stop. It became a route. Once one village found a way out of the Palatinate, others followed the same path for the next 4 decades, and many of the family names that first appeared on the 1709 refugee rolls in London would reappear, years or even decades later, on ship manifests bound directly for Philadelphia. Passage across the Atlantic was rarely free, and the way most Palatine families paid for it shaped the earliest years of their American lives as much as the crossing itself. A large share arrived as redemptioners, a system under which a family or an individual would sign a contract of indentured labor to be paid off after arrival, often auctioned to the highest bidder standing on the Philadelphia docks the moment the ship's hold was opened. Children were sometimes bound out separately from their parents to different farms, a detail that appears again and again in the ship arrival records and in the family histories descendants later pieced back together. It was not an easy beginning. Disease swept through the crowded ships during the 10 to 12-week crossing, and mortality among Palatine passengers, particularly children, was high enough that some vessels arrived having lost a third of those who boarded in Rotterdam. The families who survived the passage, paid off their indenture, and reached the Pennsylvania backcountry had already been filtered once by war, once by famine, and once by the ocean itself before they ever cleared their first acre of American forest. The religious composition of these refugees mattered as much as their geography. The Palatinate sat directly on the fault line of the Reformation, and its rulers had spent a century flipping the region's official religion back and forth between Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed Protestant, depending on which prince happened to be in power. Ordinary families were expected to convert along with their rulers or face fines, exile, or worse. Layered on top of this instability was a smaller, more radical population, the Anabaptists, direct spiritual ancestors of today's Mennonites and Amish, who rejected infant baptism and state-controlled religion altogether. Anabaptists were hunted with particular intensity. Swiss cantons executed some by drowning, a grim irony given their insistence on adult, voluntary baptism by water. Many fled north into the Palatinate itself, seeking refuge, only to find that refuge was temporary there as well. By the early 1700s, a Palatine village might contain Lutheran families, Reformed families, and a scattering of Anabaptist households who had been on the move for 2 or 3 generations already, carrying nothing but a shared conviction that European soil no longer wanted them. Several of the 16 surnames at the center of this story trace their Anabaptist roots even further back than the Palatinate itself, into the Swiss cantons of Bern and Zurich, where the Anabaptist movement first took shape in the 1520s. Names like Herr, Groff, Landis, Brubaker, Eschelmann, Kaufmann, and Stauffer appear in Swiss court and banishment records from the 1600s, families formerly exiled from their home cantons for refusing infant baptism and refusing to swear civil oaths. Many resettled first in the Alsace region and the Palatinate itself, finding a temporary, uneasy tolerance among Palatine rulers who were sometimes willing to let Anabaptist farmers work marginal land the state church did not want, before the same families joined the broader Palatine exodus a generation or 2 later and crossed to Pennsylvania. This double displacement, Swiss canton to Palatinate to Pennsylvania, is one reason genetic testing on these particular surname lines sometimes returns a result blending Swiss and Rhineland signatures rather than a single clean regional match, a detail that confuses many descendants until they learn the fuller migration story behind their own name. Waiting on the other side of the Atlantic, though most of these refugees did not know it yet, was a Quaker landowner with a very specific vision for his colony. William Penn had toured the Rhineland himself in 1671 and again in 1677, preaching religious tolerance to exactly the kind of persecuted Protestant and Anabaptist communities that populated the region. When Penn received his charter for Pennsylvania in 1681, he did not simply wait for settlers to find him. He sent agents back into the Rhineland with pamphlets, promising cheap land, freedom of worship, and no state church demanding allegiance. The first organized group of German settlers, 13 families from Krefeld, led by Francis Daniel Pastorius, arrived in 1683 and founded Germantown just outside Philadelphia. It was a small beginning. What followed it was not. Germantown itself became more than a settlement. It became an engine for preserving the language these families had carried across the ocean. In 1743, the printer, Christopher Sauer, produced the first Bible printed in a European language anywhere in the American colonies, a German language edition set on a press built in Germantown rather than shipped from Europe. Sauer's press went on to print German-language newspapers, almanacs, and religious tracts that circulated through the Pennsylvania backcountry for decades, giving isolated German-speaking farm families in Lancaster and Berks counties a steady supply of reading material in their own tongue, and with it, one more reason never to need English in daily life. A family that could read its newspaper, its almanac and its Bible in German, worship in German on Sunday, and educate its children in German-language schoolhouses had very little practical reason to look outside its own community for anything, including a spouse. Through the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, ship after ship carried Palatine families directly from Rotterdam to the port of Philadelphia. The scale eventually alarmed colonial officials enough that in 1727, Pennsylvania began requiring every adult German male arriving by ship to sign an oath of allegiance to the British Crown, a bureaucratic requirement that inadvertently created one of the richest genealogical records in American colonial history. Those ship lists, later compiled and published as a multi-volume record of Pennsylvania German immigration, still list the names, ages, and vessels of tens of thousands of Palatine arrivals. A researcher today can open those pages and find a Miller, a Hare, a Kaufmann, or a Bechtel signing his name, sometimes in a shaky German hand, sometimes with an X, on the exact ship and the exact date his family's American story began. The scale of this record is difficult to overstate. Between 1727 and the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, more than 300 ships carrying German-speaking passengers registered at the port of Philadelphia, and historians estimate that somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 German-speaking immigrants passed through that single port during the colonial period, the large majority of them Palatines and their Swiss Anabaptist neighbors. The Pennsylvania German Society, founded in 1891 specifically to preserve and study this migration, has spent well over a century cataloging church registers, land records, and cemetery inscriptions alongside the original ship lists, and it is largely through that sustained institutional effort that a modern descendant can trace a surname like Groff or Landis back to a specific congregation in Lancaster County, and from there back across the ocean to a specific parish register still held in a German or Swiss archive. The paper trail exists. It has existed the entire time. What changed is that DNA testing gave millions of descendants a reason to go looking for it. Benjamin Franklin, watching this migration swell around him in Philadelphia, did not see a promising addition to colonial society. He saw a threat to it. In an essay published in 1751, Franklin complained openly about what he called the Palatine Boers swarming into Pennsylvania, worried that the colony's English character would be overwhelmed by a population that showed no interest in learning English, no interest in English customs, and every intention of building a separate German-speaking society inside British territory. Franklin went so far as to suggest that German settlers should be required to intermix with English communities to prevent Pennsylvania from splitting into two separate peoples sharing one colony, a proposal that never gained enough support in the Assembly to become policy. He was hardly alone in the sentiment. Provincial Secretary James Logan expressed similar unease decades earlier, warning that the growing German population in the backcountry might one day outnumber the English colonists who nominally governed them. Franklin was not entirely wrong about the separateness. He was wrong about the outcome. The Palatine settlers did not overwhelm Pennsylvania in the way he feared. Instead, they moved past Philadelphia entirely, pushing west into the forested frontier counties of Lancaster, Berks, York, Lehigh, and Northampton, clearing land the English colonists had largely avoided and building a version of home that had almost nothing to do with the empire technically governing it. Lancaster County in particular became something close to a second Palatinate. By the time of the first federal census in 1790, German surnames dominated the tax and land records of the county so completely that English-speaking officials sent to administer it sometimes struggled to find enough bilingual clerks to process routine paperwork. Court proceedings in some townships were conducted with an interpreter present as a matter of course. Land was surveyed, bought, and passed down between families who shared the same church pew and, within a generation or two, the same set of grandchildren. Berks County developed along nearly identical lines, its county seat of Reading becoming a hub for German-language printing and trade that rivaled Germantown itself by the eve of the Revolution. York and Lehigh counties filled in more slowly, settled largely by the children and grandchildren of the original Rotterdam arrivals, families who had already spent one generation in America, before pushing further into the frontier in search of land their fathers' farms could no longer subdivide among so many sons. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Colonial officials outside Pennsylvania watched this pattern with a mixture of fascination and unease. Visitors touring the backcountry in the mid-1700s sometimes wrote home describing entire townships where not a word of English could be heard from one farm to the next, an observation repeated often enough in surviving travel journals and colonial correspondence that historians now treat it as a reliable, if slightly exaggerated, description of daily life in the German townships of Lancaster and Berks counties. The isolation was never absolute. These families traded with English and Scots-Irish neighbors, served alongside them in colonial militias, and eventually fought beside them in the Revolutionary War. What remained closed, almost without exception for the first several generations, was the marriage bed. Trade crossed the linguistic wall easily, kinship did not. It is worth pausing on the word Dutch itself, because it is the first clue that something in the official record was garbled almost from the moment these families stepped off the boat. When English-speaking clerks in Philadelphia asked new arrivals who they were, the answer came back in German, Deutsch. The clerks, unfamiliar with the language and working quickly through crowded ship manifests, wrote down the closest English word they knew, Dutch. It stuck. 2.5 centuries later, millions of Americans still describe themselves as Pennsylvania Dutch, a phrase that has nothing to do with the Netherlands and everything to do with a harried port clerk who misheard a language he did not speak. The error is small. What it reveals about the gap between the official record and the actual bloodline underneath it is not. Once these Palatine families cleared their land in the Pennsylvania backcountry, they did something that set them apart from almost every other immigrant population arriving in British North America during the same period. They built walls that had nothing to do with fences. German-language newspapers began circulating out of Germantown and Lancaster by the 1730s. German-language schools taught the children of these settlers to read and write in their parents' tongue rather than English. German-speaking Lutheran and Reformed congregations, and separately German-speaking Mennonite and Amish meeting houses, became the actual center of daily social life, the place where marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and community standing was measured. A young man in Lancaster County in the 1750s who wanted to court a woman outside his congregation faced more than disapproval. He faced a set of social and linguistic barriers that made the match nearly impossible before it began. She likely did not speak his dialect fluently. Her family attended a different church. His own family expected him to marry within the community that had crossed the ocean together, worshipped together, and buried its dead in the same small cemeteries. This is the mechanism that geneticists now call endogamy, and it is the single most important fact for understanding why a DNA test taken in the current year can return a percentage of Germanic ancestry that looks almost unchanged from what a laboratory might expect to find in someone born in the Rhineland itself. Endogamy describes a population that marries almost exclusively within its own boundaries for generation after generation, refusing, whether by religious conviction, language barrier, or simple social pressure, to let outside bloodlines enter the pool. Geneticists usually study this phenomenon on isolated islands or in mountain valleys cut off by geography. The Palatine settlers of Pennsylvania managed to recreate the same genetic isolation in the middle of an expanding, increasingly diverse American frontier, using culture and religion instead of mountains and water as the barrier. The Palatine settlers themselves were never a single uniform group, and the split between their two main branches shaped how completely each preserved its founding genetics. Historians and the community itself have long described this divide as Church Dutch and Plain Dutch. The Church Dutch were Lutheran and German Reformed families who built substantial farms, fought in the Revolutionary War, served in colonial assemblies, and gradually assimilated into mainstream American economic life, while still marrying almost exclusively within German-speaking congregations well into the 1800s. The Plain Dutch were the Anabaptist minority, the Amish, the Old Order Mennonites, and the Brethren, whose religious convictions demanded an even stricter separation from the world around them. Where the Church Dutch eventually loosened their marriage patterns as English became unavoidable in commerce and politics, many Plain Dutch communities maintained near total endogamy for another 2 centuries, a choice that geneticists can now measure with striking precision. At the Clinic for Special Children in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, physicians and researchers have spent decades documenting exactly what that level of isolation does to a population's genome. Old Order Amish communities in Lancaster County show elevated rates of specific recessive conditions, including Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome and glutaric aciduria type 1, disorders that are exceedingly rare in the general population but appear at measurably higher frequency among the Amish because nearly every person in the community can trace ancestry back to the same small founding group of Swiss and Palatine immigrants who arrived in the early 1700s. Community elders and church genealogists work directly with the clinic's researchers to build the family charts that made this research possible in the first place, tracing individual patients back through generations of marriage records to the handful of founding couples who first crossed the ocean. This is what population geneticists call a founder effect, and it is not speculation. It is documented, published, peer-reviewed science, built on genealogical records these communities themselves kept with remarkable care, since marriage within the church required knowing exactly who one's ancestors were. What the founder effect confirms for the plain Dutch, ordinary DNA testing quietly confirms for the church Dutch as well, even for families who left the strict Anabaptist path generations ago or who were never part of it at all. A Lutheran farming family in 1840, Ohio, 3 generations removed from the original Palatine ship list, was still overwhelmingly likely to be marrying the daughter of another Lutheran German family from the next township over, not because a church elder forbade anything, but because language, custom, and simple proximity made it the natural choice. Multiply that pattern across 6 or 7 generations from the 1720s through the early 1900s, and the mathematics becomes almost inevitable. The Rhineland genome these families carried across the Atlantic did not dilute the way population genetics would normally predict for an immigrant group. It concentrated, generation after generation, inside a closed loop that had nothing to do with race and everything to do with church membership, dialect, and the simple fact that the German-speaking farm down the road was always more available than the English-speaking one 3 towns away. The 16 surnames at the center of this story each carry a piece of that closed loop, and each one shows the same pattern of a German original quietly reshaped by American ears and American paperwork. Müller became Miller, one of the most common surnames in the entire Pennsylvania German record, appearing on ship lists from the 1720s onward, and eventually scattering from Lancaster County into Ohio, Indiana, and Ontario as later generations pushed west and north in search of new farmland. Weber became Weaver, a name tied directly to the linen and wool trades many Palatine families practiced before they ever touched American soil. Schneider became Snyder, sometimes Snyder, a name so thoroughly anglicized in spelling that many modern descendants have no idea it once meant tailor in the language their ancestors spoke at home. Zimmerman, meaning carpenter, kept its shape almost entirely intact as Zimmerman, one of the few names on this list that survived the crossing with barely a letter changed. Fisher softened into Fisher. König, meaning king, became king, a translation rather than a phonetic shift, chosen deliberately by families eager to sound less foreign on English-language land deeds and militia rolls. Klein, meaning small, became Klein in most branches, and occasionally Klein, and clusters heavily in the same Lancaster and Berks County records that hold the other 15 names on this list. Huber, an old term for a farmer holding a particular unit of land under medieval tenure law, became Hoover, a name that would eventually rise to the highest office in the country without most Americans ever connecting it back to a Palatine farming family. Kaufman, meaning merchant, kept most of its structure as Kaufman and remains one of the most recognizable surnames in Old Order Amish and Mennonite communities today, appearing with remarkable frequency in the genealogical charts the Clinic for Special Children uses to trace inherited conditions back to their founding source. De Stoffer, Hare, Groff, Landis, Brubaker, Bechtel, and Eshelman round out the 16, each one a name that appears again and again in the same tight cluster of Lancaster County church records, land deeds, and cemetery listings, generation after generation, rarely intermarrying with a surname from outside the same closed circle of Palatine and Swiss origin families. What makes these 16 names worth tracing today is not simply that they survived. Plenty of colonial surnames survived. It is that they survived without dissolving into the surrounding population the way population genetics would normally predict for any immigrant group given 300 years and an open frontier. A modern DNA testing company does not read a family tree. It does not know that a particular Miller or Hare fought in the Revolutionary War, or that a particular Hoover family has lived in the same Ohio township since 1815. It reads long, unbroken stretches of genetic code and compares them against reference populations drawn from specific regions of the world. When that code comes back as a large, concentrated block matching populations still living in the Rhineland and the border regions of Switzerland today, the algorithm is not making an error. It is reporting, with more precision than any family Bible ever could, exactly how completely these 16 surname groups kept their founding bloodline intact. The families themselves rarely framed what they were doing in genetic terms, of course. They framed it in terms of faith, language, and survival. Accounts passed down through Mennonite and Amish family histories describe grandmothers well into the 20th century who spoke almost no English at all, conducting their entire domestic life in Pennsylvania Dutch, the German dialect that developed among these communities and that still survives today among Old Order groups in Lancaster County, Holmes County, Ohio, and Elkhart County, Indiana. Family historians researching their own Kaufmann, Hare, or Stauffer lines have described opening a grandparent's Bible and finding the family name recorded in an older German spelling entirely, Kaufmann or Stauffer, with an umlaut long since dropped, a small but permanent record of the exact generation when the name began its slow drift toward its modern American form. These are not invented details. They are the kind of finding that shows up repeatedly in Pennsylvania German Genealogical Society archives, in county historical records, and in the oral histories collected from the last generation of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, before the dialect began to fade from daily use, outside the strict Old Order communities. The migration did not stop at Pennsylvania's borders, and neither did the endogamy that carried these 16 surnames forward. As farmland grew scarce and families grew large, often 10 or 12 children per household, later generations pushed further west and further north, carrying their closed marriage patterns with them like a portable wall. After the Revolutionary War, a significant wave of Pennsylvania German Mennonite families migrated north into Ontario, settling what became Waterloo County, and founding communities that still carry the same Brubaker, Eshelman, and Bechtel surnames found in the original Lancaster County records. Others moved into Ohio's Holmes and Wayne counties, now home to one of the largest Amish populations in the world, and into Indiana's Elkhart and LaGrange counties, and into Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, where German Lutheran and Reformed families built farming communities that remained culturally distinct from their English and Scots-Irish neighbors for generations. Wherever these families moved, the same names appear in the same tight clusters, married to the same surrounding names, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of endogamy stretching from the burned villages of the 17th century Rhineland to farmhouses standing today in 5 or 6 different American states and 1 Canadian province. For a family living inside this pattern, the moment of recognition rarely comes from a history book. It comes from a small plastic tube and a website that was never designed with genealogical poetry in mind. A descendant of one of these 16 surname lines submits a sample expecting the diluted, unremarkable mix of British and European ancestry that most multi-generation American families receive. What comes back instead is a single, overwhelming block, sometimes 40%, sometimes 60%, occasionally higher, concentrated in the Rhineland, Switzerland, and the border regions between them. Family message boards and genealogical forums are full of exactly this reaction, ordinary people describing the moment they realized their tidy story of colonial pioneers and revolutionary ancestors sat on top of something far more specific and far more intact than they had ever imagined. Some had always assumed a name like Snyder or Bechtel was simply English, an assumption never corrected because nobody in living memory still spoke the language that would have given it away. Some had grown up hearing a grandparent described only as old-fashioned or old country in her habits, never quite understanding that she was the last living link to a dialect and a closed community that had preserved a 17th century Rhineland genome almost perfectly for 250 years. What survives in that DNA result is not myth, and it is not exaggeration. It is the measurable outcome of a population that endured the 30 Years' War, the scorched earth campaigns of Louis XIV, the Great Frost of 1709, and a century of religious persecution, only to cross an ocean and build a new kind of wall out of language and church membership rather than stone. Every one of these 16 surnames still appears today in the same counties, the same congregations, and often the same cemeteries that first received them nearly 300 years ago, a continuity few American bloodlines of any origin can claim with the same unbroken clarity. The 16 surnames carried inside that wall, Miller, Weaver, Snyder, Zimmerman, Fisher, King, Klein, Hoover, Kaufmann, Stauffer, Hare, Groff, Landis, Brubaker, Bechtel, and Eshelman, did not simply survive the crossing. They preserved something that most immigrant bloodlines in American history were never able to keep whole. A closed genetic record, still readable today, still concentrated, still carrying the exact signature of a people who decided, generation after generation, that they would rather remain apart than disappear into the surrounding country. The Rhine emptied its refugees into a Pennsylvania forest 3 centuries ago, and in a surprising number of American households today, the river has never actually stopped running. If one of these 16 names sits in your own family tree, the record waiting inside your own DNA may be more complete and more specific than any paper genealogy your family ever wrote down. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.